So I've recently discovered a couple words for things that I've had an attraction to in art, but I didn't know they had official words.
Hypnagogia and Hauntology. Weird, esoteric words. Oh no! Here comes all the pretension in the entire world.
Thing is, these are things that I've actively thought about over the course of my artistic career, but it's really nice to put it into some basic terms that help us understand the aesthetic of what we want to accomplish and what can be achieved with that aesthetic.
So hypnagogia is a term referring to the state of mind one is in right before they fall asleep. It's a moment of hyper-reality that exists when reality is still clearly there, but it edges on a type of dreamlike fantasy. We know that what we're seeing is reality, but it's obviously not. It's a blurred line of our world and that of a dream state. Now, this idea is often used in many a field of study, like psychology. Some people experience extreme hypnagogia that goes on for days, but we've all experienced it at least once in our life. Some experience strange, almost psychedelic sounds and music. Some hear their own name being called from the ether. Some have their own deepest fears and desires presented to them. All while they're sort of awake.
I mean, it's difficult to hear about these kinds of things and not immediately find them inspiring. And a lot of artists throughout history have interrogated these concepts and tried to understand them or tried to portray them in interesting ways. So let's take a look at some of that.
This is Goya's Sleep of Reason Produces Monsters from the end of the 18th century. It's an etching that reflects the artist himself sleeping amongst his tools. Behind him are his fears, doubts, societal pressures that run free in his dreams. This is the state of unreality portrayed in which we see both the reality and the dream. This moment in time is hypnagogic. In going to sleep, he's allowing himself to be attacked by a personification of his own paranoias. But admittedly, this isn't my favorite Goya. This is Witch's Sabbath, or maybe Saturn Devouring His Son. Both of them are pretty good. I go back and forth. These are some of the last paintings he ever made because his physical and mental health were rapidly deteriorating. He painted these directly on the walls of his home, wrote nothing about them, and died shortly afterward. Now, if we ask ourselves if he was seeing the world in a vastly different reality because of his deteriorating state, we can't really be sure, but I think these paintings reflect a clear pseudo-hypnagogic perspective. These paintings feel like a lucid hallucination of someone nearing the end of reality. But moving right along, here's a painting by Henry Fuseli called The Nightmare. There's a whole series of these that portray variations of the same portrayed state. Very similar to Goya's work, this portrays both someone sleeping and the vision of the dream itself, blending reality and unreality to create something that sits right between the two. Now here's a little unnecessary personal information, but I get sleep paralysis with some frequency. It's happened to me most of my life, and nowadays it almost always happens when I fall asleep on my left side, which I can't control, and god damn it, it sucks. In my sleep paralysis, I experience a lot of strange hallucinations from auditory to visual, so I strongly relate to this Fuseli series in how it accurately portrays that state of paralysis. One is overtaken by the inability to move. It feels as if something is sitting on your chest and unseen forces torture you with incoherent sounds and visuals. These paintings honestly portray this between state of being awake and dreaming, but you'll notice that I included the auditory hallucinations in there as well as the visuals because often that is an enormous part of the experience and thus is expressed in art as well. There's a subgenre of music devoted entirely to this hypnagogic experience simply called hypnagogic pop, but it turns out that this term is a bit more loaded than one might believe, given the term hypnagogic pop refers to a very specific movement of music that we'll get to in a bit.
But on a somewhat philosophical level, I think a lot of people would say that music is inherently dreamlike. Essentially using sound to express emotions or events or perspective is unreality.
But this is where we get to make the distinction between what is inherently dreamlike and what is hypnagogic. To briefly go back to the painting, the reason this is hypnagogic is because of the reality portrayed in relation to the unreality. It is both, simultaneously. And now we can talk about hypnagogic music. Throbbing Gristle and Psychic TV are projects led by Genesis P. Orge. Both projects feature industrial noise and synthetic instrumentation that sounds vaguely like something that exists in reality but is fading and replaced by a nightmare. It's the the raw emotionality of the best of music, but crushed by a reality. The intention of this was to build the true sounds of a higher state of consciousness. By listening, you allow yourself to experience a world that is distant from our own. The prime example of this, in my opinion, is the song 20 Jazz Funk Greats, a song that feels like a jazz band trapped in like a synthetic hell. If hell had elevators, they would be playing this song.
The idea of it somewhat portraying a type of music that we're familiar with, but then taking it to this other, more absorbing and kind of unreal place makes it hypnagogic in my view. And it kind of changed the way that we view this artistic aesthetic in music.
Moving right into the quote-unquote actual hypnagogic pop of the early 2000s, we see something wildly different from what we saw with Goya, Fuseli, or Throbbing Gristle. It has a lot in common with the previous mentions, with the exception that a whole lot of it is recorded on tape, or lo-fi for those of you out there more familiar with that term. Artists like John Mouse, Ariel Pink, James Ferraro, Pocahontas, and Spencer Clark took the ideas presented and radically changed them by recontextualizing them within the ideas of hauntology, nostalgia, retro sound that draws attention to himself, i.e. bad home tape recordings, and otherworldly design.
What makes it specifically hypnagogic is its relationship between the present and the past. It's as if we're directly interacting with our perceptions of a time and place through the vehicle of a dream.
It's a time and a place that's tangible, as with the cheap home recording that draws attention to itself in its realness, but what is being done with the medium drastically alters our perception of a time and place. But that nostalgic element is something that we haven't seen before in this lineage of hypnagogic art, or at least as we've been discussing it. That's where we get into this term hauntology, which has a variety of meanings depending on who you talk to about it and what slant they kind of take with it, but we're going to focus primarily on hauntology through an artistic lens and what that actually means. So hauntology refers to a temporal disjunction that haunts culture. Much like a ghost, this disjunction has no real origin or no real end. It just is.
The idea of this is that we have nostalgia for a time that culture never knew.
This is often referred to as retrofuturism. Basically, had the past never really advanced technologically, what would our contemporary culture look like or sound like? What if music never really changed from what it was in the 80s? What would modern new wave music sound like?
Hauntology refers to this idea that we have nostalgia for a future that doesn't exist, but it kind of does in some sort of unreal way. It's as if we're haunted by all the possible times that we could be living in, but we're living in ours.
But the majesty of this particular brand of music that came out of this is the mixture between the two terms, hypnagogic, hauntology, the nostalgic dream of the future we never had. It's a mixture between a tangible thing and something that is unreal, thus the hypnagogic part.
In practice, this is the mentality that in creating the future, we need to look to the past and interrogate its radical possibilities. The rate at which the world's art and culture move forward doesn't really allow us to truly understand and explore everything about something before we're too soon past it. Also, we carry with us a mentality that the past never really had, but in using their technology and their methodology, what does that create in our current perspective? In a weird way, this ideology creates the future that never came to pass, that we're so very nostalgic for. I think in our modern times we have a bit of a stigma with this, especially when it comes to like the modern state of film.
We have a big problem with creators referencing the past or trying to recapture or recreate the past in a new light because we see it as treading old ground instead of trying to make something original. But just like the ghost of our possible futures now, this ghost is infinite. It has always haunted our cultural consciousness. For example, this is the Farnese ceiling in Rome. It was painted by Annibale and Agostino Carracci in the 17th century. It depicts several stories of the loves of the gods from Ovid's Metamorphoses. Each story is a painting inside its own illusionistic frame. Along with the stories in the frames, statues and actual people are painted on the outside interacting with the ceiling's frames. Now, while we can look at this as being amazing or wholly original just on the merit that we've never seen this sort of thing before, it's important to note that this work was painted on the ceiling of the Palazzo Farnese, which contained a collection of some of the most amazing ancient sculptures in existence. And over the course of the ceiling's production, which was several years, the Carracci studied these statues, along with the work of Raphael and the figure construction of Michelangelo. And using all of this historical information, they created this. And as you look through the body of art history, you see the same story told time and time again of the influential masterwork, making reference to the work that they were inspired by and going backward from there. We are, as artists, by and large, a product of much of the environment we felt strongly towards in our youth and in our contemporary landscape.
It is distinctly possible to look back into the past and ask questions of it, and using our art as a template, create a new future out of it, or at least create the dream of the future, the state right before we close our eyes.
The benefit of the internet is that our entire cultural history and lineage is here for us to investigate and understand. We have access to our entire cultural history, and we can look at it critically and create the future.
I think that's the ultimate point I want to make with this video. Like, these strange, esoteric words and concepts have haunted our cultural psychology as far back as we can look. From Goya to Fuseli to our modern times, we've been obsessed with this idea of dream states and our cultural history and our screen memories of what the past actually was, and more importantly, what it means to us.
So next time you're stuck trying to find a source of inspiration, maybe look to the past and dream of the future. Yeah. Hello! So this was my kind of experimental video on Hypnagogia and Hauntology, something that I'm interested in, but I was thinking about how I could translate it to video, and it turned out to be more like this kind of documentary thing than an actual like video that I would traditionally make, but I think that I was kind of successful in what I wanted to do with it, and I hope you see it the same way. I really want to thank my patrons over at patreon.com/NickSpheres. You guys are wonderful because you allowed me to do this, and I have another very large project coming up pretty soon, and I can tell you with some confidence that I would not be able to do it without my Patreon supporters, because it's kind of massive, and it's taken up all my time and energy, so we'll see what happens there. Also, if you liked this video, go ahead and, let me know in the comments. Hit a like button if you can find one. Perhaps subscribe. I'm getting somewhat close to 70,000 subscribers. My goal is to get 100,000 subscribers by Christmas, which is in 25 days. So I have 25 days to get 30,000 subscribers. I believe in myself. I don't think that's gonna happen. That was a little joke. Anyway, so thank you guys for watching, and I will talk to you very soon. Goodbye!